A folded note fell from her prayer book reading, "They will come by Sunday." The note was tucked between Psalms and Proverbs. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't looking at the book at all. I'd picked it up off her kitchen table because I was cold and my hands needed something to hold, and the thing fell open and the note slipped out and landed on the plank floor, and I read it before I understood what I was reading. 7 words, penciled in a hand I didn't recognize, small caps like whoever wrote it had wanted to be clear. "They will come by Sunday." I stood there in Nora Vasquez's kitchen with the note in my fingers and the fire going low behind me, and I didn't hear anything for a moment. Not the wind off the flats, not the mule shifting in the lean-to, not the dog on the porch that usually announced everything. Nothing. Just those 7 words doing their work in my chest, and the smell of the beans she'd left simmering on the stove, and the faint scent of candle wax and cedar that lived in everything she owned. Then I heard her boots on the porch steps, and I had to decide fast what I was going to do. I put the note back the way I found it, closed the book, set it down on the table, sat in the chair nearest the fire and wrapped both hands around the cup of coffee she'd poured me before going out, and I waited for her to come in, and the whole time I waited I felt those 7 words sitting in my chest like a stone that had been dropped from a height. You want to know how I got to that kitchen? You're going to have to go back a ways. Not all the way. I'm not a man who tells his whole life to anyone, and I'm not starting now, but back far enough that the note makes sense and that what happened after makes sense. My name is Cole Drennan. For a long time that name meant something in the wrong circles. Not a reputation I chased or much of one I was proud of, but there it was. I'd ridden with men who took what wasn't theirs, in the years after the war when the law was a suggestion in most of the territory, and the only thing that mattered was what you could hold. I wasn't the worst of them. I wasn't the best. I was just a young man who'd come home from 4 years of killing to find nothing waiting, no farm, no family left standing, no trade, no future. And I'd made choices in that emptiness that I spent the next 15 years trying to get out from under. Getting out from under a name is harder than it sounds, harder than earning it even. The war had taken everything I understood about myself and sorted it into what remained useful and what didn't. And what remained useful was a facility with horses, a working knowledge of firearms, a high tolerance for discomfort, and an ability to follow orders from men I didn't much respect when the alternative was worse. What didn't survive was any belief that the rules applied evenly, or that the men who made them had the right to make them, or that a man from nowhere with nothing was expected by the universe to find his way back to nothing and be content with it. I was 22 when I came home to a farm that had burned, and a mother who hadn't survived the winter of '65. I was 23 when I first rode with the Morrow Bunch out of New Mexico, and I was 24 and a half when I made the worst choice of the 19 months I rode with them. The Morrow Bunch were not principled men, but they were organized and they were careful, and for a while the two things together kept us out of the worst trouble. We took cattle here and there, moved horses that weren't ours, ran payroll in a period when everyone in the territory seemed to be running payroll, and the law was too thin-spread to stop it. I'm not making excuses. I'm just telling you the shape of the world I was operating in, because the shape matters. The worst night was in April of '68. We hit the Continental stage on the Mesilla Road. Morrow had intelligence about a strongbox that turned out to be accurate, and what the intelligence had not included was the woman. She was a passenger, middle-aged, traveling alone, dressed well enough to suggest she wasn't used to being in the middle of the territories at night with her hands shaking. She sat in the corner of the coach and she looked at each of our faces while Morrow's men worked, and her looking was specific. She was marking us. You could tell by the way her eyes moved, not flinching away, actually committing us to memory, one face after another, with a deliberateness that told you she intended to be useful about what she'd seen. She wasn't harmed. I want to be clear about that, because it mattered to me then and it matters to me now. Not a hair. Whatever else Morrow's men were, they weren't that kind, or at least they weren't that night, and I put myself between her and two men who were eyeing her jewelry in a way I didn't like, and the jewelry stayed on her and nothing else happened to her beyond the fright. But the fright was real. I've thought about that for years. The way her hands shook when we rode off. The sound she made, not a cry, just a small compressed sound of fear that she tried to suppress and couldn't quite. I heard it as we rode away, and I've heard it a lot of times since in the middle of the night. That sound is part of what I carry. A month after the Mesilla Road job, I left the bunch. I'd been thinking about leaving for the better part of a year. The work had darkened. The men had darkened. Morrow himself had developed a taste for problems solved quickly and finally that I wanted no part of, and the night on the Mesilla Road was the last piece that needed to move. I told Morrow I was going north and he told me to be careful, and that was the end of it. Nobody chases their own out of that kind of outfit, because you don't want the kind of man who knows what you know to have a reason to talk. I went north. I worked honest, or as close to honest as I could get. Drifted and worked and drifted and worked, and every couple of years the name would catch up to me and I'd move again, and the years stacked up and the distance between me and Morrow's bunch got longer, and after a while I'd begun to think that maybe the name was finally behind me. I was 37 when I hit the San Esteban Valley. Long, slow valley between two low ranges, pinyon and cedar on the slopes, good grass on the flats when the rains came. A town of maybe 300 souls, and out from it spreads of various sizes running cattle and some sheep, and a little dry farming along the creek drainages. The man who hired me was a Basque named Vicent Arriaga, who ran 600 head on the south end of the valley and asked his new hands one question: can you ride and can you work? I said yes to both, and he said that would do. I stayed 2 years with Arriaga. 2 good years, the longest I'd been in one place since the war. I kept my head down and did the work and was paid fair wages and sent money nowhere because there was nobody to send it to, and I saved most of it and spent the rest on what a working man spends it on. I learned the valley and the valley's rhythms. I learned which ranchers were fair and which weren't, which horses were sound, which creek crossings were dangerous in flood season. I learned who could be counted on. I learned about Nora Vasquez mostly by osmosis, the way you learn about your neighbors in a small place. Her name came up in various contexts. She ran the Vasquez place 4 miles east of Arriaga's, a small outfit that had been her husband's and was now hers. The husband, Tomás, had been dead 3 years. I gathered there were complicated feelings in the valley about Tomás Vasquez, and I didn't push for details. The manner in which people avoided the subject told me what I needed to know. I'd seen Nora twice at a distance before the morning with the calf. She was a dark-haired woman in her early 40s, plain-featured in the way of people who have weathered a good deal, with a straight back and a deliberate walk. She came to corrals for supplies about once a month, and she came alone, and she loaded her own wagon. I'd noticed her because you notice people who move through the world like that, self-contained, not performing, just doing what needed doing. The April snow came through late and heavy, 1.5 feet on the flats and more in the draws, and on my way back from checking Arriaga's upper fence line, I found the cow down in a drift at the edge of the Vasquez land, a first calf heifer who'd picked the worst possible location to go into labor. The calf's position was bad. The heifer was exhausted, and the cold was going to take both of them inside an hour if something didn't happen. I didn't think about it, I just stopped and got to work. It took 2 hours and it was everything you'd expect. My knees in the snow, both arms where they needed to be, the cold working into me from every direction, and the heifer working against me from the one direction that mattered most. The calf came wrong way and I had to correct it, and that part was its own particular misery. When it was finally over, the calf was breathing and the heifer was on her feet, and I was soaked through in 8 different ways and shaking from the cold. I was walking my horse back toward Arriaga's fence line when I heard her behind me. "You're going to freeze," she said. I turned. She was 10 yards back, her hair loose, her heavy wrap pulled tight, and she was looking at me with the particular assessing look of someone deciding whether a situation is actually as bad as it appears. She'd been watching from somewhere. I hadn't heard her come out, but she'd been watching long enough to see most of it. "I'll be all right," I said. She looked at my soaked jacket and shirt in the April cold, and she did not appear to share my assessment. "Come inside," she said. "There's a fire. I'll heat water." "Ma'am, I don't need." "The calf would have died," she said. "Come inside." Not warmly, not coldly either, just, "This is the situation and the appropriate response to it, and would you please stop arguing?" I came inside. Her kitchen was small and clean. There was a wooden cross above the table, a prayer book on the table, a small painting of the Virgin in a tin frame by the window. A woman who lived seriously in her faith. You could see that, not performing it but actually inside it. The way some people are, it was in the corners of the room, in the absence of clutter, in the particular care of everything placed where it was placed. She heated water without fuss and brought me a blanket without asking and put coffee on, and we didn't talk much while I warmed up. When we did talk, it was about the cattle, the spring weather, how long I'd been with Arriaga. She asked that last question without the follow-up question that usually came after it and before Arriaga, and I noticed the absence. Her name was Nora. She said it when she handed me the coffee, just her name and nothing more, in the matter-of-fact way of a woman introducing herself rather than performing an introduction. I told her mine. She nodded as if confirming something she'd already known. When I left, she shook my hand at the door. Strong grip, brief. She said, "I'm grateful," and she said it once and meant it. After that we were something. Not friends exactly, not at first. But we knew each other, and in a valley as quiet as San Esteban, that's its own kind of relationship. We'd wave when our paths crossed. In May she left a jar of pickled peppers and a short note on Arriaga's fence post, a thank you for the calf. In June, Arriaga sent me over to help with a water problem in her irrigation ditch, a job that took 2 days, and by the end of the second day, we were talking the way people talk when they're tired and have been working alongside each other, and the performance has dropped off. Easy, somewhat out of order, without the usual shape of getting acquainted conversation. She told me about her family, the Vasquez family history in the valley, her parents who'd run sheep 2 generations back, her brothers scattered to Colorado and California. She told me about the land, how it worked and what it needed, where the drainage went wrong in wet years and what she'd done about it. She told me about the church in corrals, the particular rhythm of the liturgical year as she practiced it, with a specificity that told me this wasn't background noise in her life, but the actual structure she lived inside. I told her less, not because I was hiding things exactly, or not only because of that, but because what I had to tell about myself ran into the years I wasn't telling, and working around them made the telling thin. She didn't push. She seemed to understand, or at least to accept, that some part of the story had a door on it. She was funny, quietly. Dry, precise, almost accidental. She'd say something that was objectively very funny and then seem mildly surprised that it had come out that way. Once, talking about a neighboring rancher's perpetual and hopeless plan to dam the main creek, she said something that made me laugh hard enough that I had to stop what I was doing and just stand there for a moment. And she looked at me with raised eyebrows, as if my laughing was the surprising thing rather than what she'd said. "Tomás used to say I was too serious to laugh," she said after a moment, and then she laughed at that too, and there was something in the sound of it, both sad and genuinely amused, that I found I wanted to hear again. I kept my distance in the right ways. I didn't push toward anything because I wasn't a man in a position to push toward things. I had my history and my uncertain future and the perpetual awareness that my name might catch up with me, and these weren't things you invited a woman to share. So I helped when I could and stayed inside the lines of what was appropriate, and let whatever was between us breathe on its own. By fall, I was finding reasons to come by once a week or so. Fence work, a barn door that needed rehanging, a cracked adobe wall to patch before the first hard frost. She'd feed me lunch. We'd sit on the porch for a while after, looking at the hills, not saying much. The hills were worth looking at, the pinyon and cedar coming down to the edge of the grass, the light in the afternoon going amber and long, the occasional hawk working the updrafts. A thing as plain as sitting on a porch and looking at hills had been outside my life for so long I'd stopped noticing the absence. Now I noticed. There were moments between us that went past the practical, and I let them pass and didn't pull them back. The way she'd hand me something across the table with her hand staying in contact half a second longer than necessary. The way she'd look at me sometimes when I was talking, not just listening but actually looking, like she was reading something more than the words. The evening I stayed late helping her move some hay before a coming storm, and when the rain finally came, we stood in the barn doorway watching it, and she stood close enough that I could feel the warmth off her arm, and neither of us said anything for several minutes, and neither of us moved away. These were things I filed and didn't act on. I'd have my reasons for that examined by events soon enough. The trouble arrived, as trouble mostly does, from a direction you're watching something else. A man named Garrett Sully came to Corrals in late September. I didn't see him come in. I heard about him from Arriaga, who'd been to town and come back with that particular thinness around his mouth that I'd learned to read as the expression he wore when something had required him to be more careful in a conversation than he'd expected. He sat down across from me at supper and told me a man was in town asking questions. One of the questions had been about a Cole Drennan who used to ride with the Morrow Bunch. The Morrow Bunch, 14 years gone. I sat with the name in my ears and let Arriaga finish what he had to say. Sully was a federal marshal, out of the Texas office originally, had been tracking remnants of the Morrow operation for some years. Most of the men who'd ridden with Morrow were dead or imprisoned. There were 2 or 3, Sully apparently believed, who'd managed to stay loose. My name had come to him through some chain of information he'd assembled, a name here, a location there, the way these things get put together when a man is patient and persistent enough. When Arriaga was done, I thanked him. He said whatever I did about it was my own affair. He said it like he meant it, which is the kind of man Vicent Arriaga was. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the bunkhouse. I was the only hand wintering on the place, the others long since drifted south, and I ran through the arithmetic. The robbery charge, statute of limitations, was 5 years in most territories, 7 at the outside. That was long dead. The intimidation of the stage passenger, harder to categorize, harder to extinguish, depending on how the charge was written. A federal marshal who wanted to be creative had more tools available than a territorial one. Even setting the legal question aside, there was the simpler fact. A man with a badge in town asking about me was enough to end things here. Arriaga couldn't afford the association. The ranchers who'd started to know me, the people in corrals who'd started to see me as a working man rather than a drifter, all of that would go. The name would reassert itself, and I'd reassert myself somewhere else, the way I'd done it before. I thought about running. I thought about it with a thoroughness I hadn't had to bring to the question in a few years. North to Colorado, then further if needed. I had a good horse, saved money, nobody waiting for me. The mechanics were straightforward. The mechanics were always straightforward. That had never been the hard part. I lay in the dark and I looked at the ceiling of the bunkhouse and I asked myself what I actually wanted. Not what was practical, not what was safe, not what the old self-protective instinct said. What did I actually want? I wanted to stay. That was the thing under all the arithmetic, the plain, inconvenient, irrational fact. I wanted to stay in this valley and keep working for Arriaga and ride past the Vasquez place in the mornings and see the smoke from her chimney, and sit on her porch again in the afternoon light, and find out, slowly, properly, in the way she'd want to find out, whether what was between us was going to become anything. I hadn't wanted anything that specific in a very long time. Wanting things made you vulnerable, and I'd protected myself from that for years by keeping wants small. But this one had gotten large without my noticing, and now here it was, and I couldn't put it away. I went asleep eventually, surprised myself with that. The next 3 weeks were quiet in the particular way of a situation that is developing slowly and out of sight. Sully stayed in corrals. Occasionally word drifted back to me. He was at the hotel, he was talking to people, he was not in any hurry. Patient men with a purpose are the most dangerous kind in my experience. The impatient ones make mistakes, the patient ones build. I kept working. I did not change my routine, because changing your routine is its own advertisement to anyone who's watching. I fed cattle and mended fence and did the winter preparations and went to corrals for supplies when it was time to go, and I kept my eyes open without letting on that I was keeping them open. What those 3 weeks were like, underneath the routine, I want to be honest about that. There's a particular quality to waiting for something you know is coming, but can't see clearly yet. Every morning I'd wake in the bunkhouse, and for about 2 seconds everything would be ordinary, the smell of the cold air, the sound of the horses, the gray light coming in the east-facing window, and then the situation would reassemble itself in my mind, and the 2 seconds of ordinary would be over. I'd lie there for another minute or two and think through what I knew, which wasn't much, and what I didn't know, which was most of it, and then I'd get up and start the day. The working helped. Physical work has a way of quieting the mind that I'd learned young and relied on heavily. There is no room for abstract fear in the concrete problem of a fence section that won't hold, or a water line that's blocked, or a calf that won't take its mother. The problem is there, and you are there, and the problem requires your full attention, and in that full attention, the other thing has to wait. I ate well, which is a thing a man sometimes forgets to do when he's worried. Arriaga's wife left me food before she went to her mother's in town, and I ate it, and I slept on the schedule I kept, and I didn't drink, which I occasionally did, and which I decided was not a thing I wanted to do right now. I wanted my mind clear. The valley itself was doing what it did in October, going beautiful and cold. The cottonwoods along the creek drainage going yellow and then gold and then dropping. The hills changing color as the pinyon and juniper settled into their winter dark greens. There were mornings when the light hit the east ridge just right and the whole thing went amber and gold, and you could stand outside the bunkhouse and look at it and think, well, whatever happens, this is a thing I've had. The particular beauty of a particular valley on particular mornings. That's mine, and it goes with me wherever I end up. I don't know why that thought helped, but it did. I saw Nora twice in those 3 weeks, and I didn't tell her anything. She wasn't involved, and I didn't want her involved. Both times I helped with what needed helping, ate lunch, sat on the porch. Both times I carried things I didn't say, and she looked at me once or twice in a way that made me think she might be seeing the weight of them, but she didn't ask, and I was grateful for it. The first time, it was fence work on the east side of her property, a section we'd been meaning to get to before winter. We worked it together, both of us on the tools, and it was a good morning's work. Solid, satisfying, the posts solid in the hard October ground. She made biscuits for lunch, and we ate them with dried beef and coffee, and I watched the hills from her kitchen table and thought about the same hills from the road on my way over. How they looked from slightly different angles at slightly different times of day, and how I'd been looking at them long enough now that I had the whole vocabulary of them. She asked me, over lunch, whether I'd heard from any family lately. She asked it conversationally, not as a loaded question, and I told her no, there wasn't much family left to hear from, and what there was had scattered after the war. She nodded, unsurprised, the way people nod when they expected that answer. A lot of people in the valley had similar stories. The war had done that, scattered families, ended lines, severed the ordinary connections that held people to places. My brother Ernesto writes from California, she said. Twice a year, always at Christmas and at his youngest son's birthday. The letters are the same every time. He's well. The weather is different from here. He misses the valley but isn't coming back. She paused. I think the letters are less for me than for him. What do you mean? Proof that he still has a sister, she said. That he hasn't lost the whole connection. The letter matters more as an act than as a communication. I thought about that. The act of maintaining a connection, even a thin one, as proof that it exists. You don't write back, I said. I do, she said. I write the same letter he writes. I'm well. The weather is colder than California. I miss him, but I'm not leaving. She said it matter-of-factly, without complaint, and then she ate a biscuit and looked at the hills, and there was something in her face, not sadness exactly, more like the settled acknowledgement of a situation that is what it is, that I found I wanted to ask more about but didn't. Not my place, not yet. The second time I went over, about a week later, she had a problem with one of the adobe walls on the north side of the house. A crack had developed, and there was some seeping at the base of it that needed attention before the first hard freeze. We worked on it most of the afternoon. Adobe work is particular and somewhat meditative. The mixing of the mud, the application in layers, the patience required to let it set before you continue. And we didn't talk much while we worked, just the occasional question about how it was looking or which section needed more attention. Late in the afternoon, when the light was going, she made coffee and we sat on the porch with it despite the cold, which was something we'd started doing in the summer and hadn't stopped. She had a wool wrap and I had my coat and we were both fine. She said, looking at the hills, "Are you all right?" Not asking for details, just asking. The kind of question that isn't demanding information, just acknowledging that something might be being carried. Working on it, I said. She nodded. That was enough. I thought about that, writing back. The economy of it, how much she'd conveyed by asking without pushing, how much I'd conveyed by not deflecting. Two people who had learned to trust each other's judgment about what needed saying and what didn't. The Wednesday before the Sunday of the note, I went to Corrals for supplies. Sully was outside the hotel, sitting in a chair against the wall in the afternoon sun. He looked at me as I drove the wagon past, and I felt his eyes on my face the way you feel weather coming, a specific kind of pressure. He was matching a description to a face. I could tell by the way he looked, not looking at me as a man looks at a stranger on a street, but looking at me as a man looks at something he's been expecting. I tipped my hat to him, same as I'd tip it to any man. I loaded my supplies. I drove back to the Arriaga place and I sat with what I'd seen in his face for the rest of that day and into the evening. What I'd seen was certainty. Not aggression, not urgency. Certainty. The look of a man who knows what comes next. That night I began quietly putting things in order. Not running, not yet, maybe not at all, but organizing the way a man organizes when he isn't sure what's coming but knows something is. I knew where my money was. I knew the horse was well shod. I kept the Winchester clean and accessible and told myself I was just being practical. Friday morning, Arriaga's youngest boy came out on a pony with a message. His father had gone to town Thursday and heard something. 2 men had arrived on the stage from the south and taken rooms at the hotel. Big men, hired guns by the look of them. They were with Sully. 3 of them now. I finished the fence section I was working on because it needed finishing, and then I went back to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of my bunk and looked at the wall for a while. Here was the shape of it, as clearly as I could see it. Sully had a badge and he had men, and he had 2 weeks to build whatever legal architecture he needed. If he came to the Arriaga place, Vicent would be caught in the middle, and Vicent had a family and a life here and didn't deserve what getting between a federal marshal and his quarry would cost. Sully was not going to be stopped by reason or argument from a man he'd been tracking for years. But if I ran, and I turned this over and looked at it from every angle, if I ran, the running would go on forever. There was nowhere to run to that was different from what I was running from. The name would follow. The past would follow. I would spend whatever years I had left being the same man I'd been, just in different places, and that man was someone I was tired of being. I saddled my horse and rode east. I don't know that I had a conscious plan when I rode to Nora's place that afternoon. I told myself I was checking on the north pasture fence we'd talked about fixing before winter, and that was not entirely untrue. But I'd fixed more urgent problems that week without feeling the need to go check on them in person, and if I was being honest with myself, which I was trying to be more of these days, I went because I needed to see her, needed to be in that kitchen for a few minutes. Needed to sit on the porch and look at the hills with someone who made me feel like staying was worth something. She wasn't on the porch. The prayer book was on the table. I called out from the doorway. She'd left it unlocked, as she usually did during daylight, and she called back from outside somewhere, in the lean-to it sounded like, and told me to come in. I came in and picked up the prayer book without thinking because my hands were cold and restless, and the book opened in my hands and the note fell out and landed on the plank floor. 7 words. I stood there with those words working in me, and I had about 30 seconds to decide what to do before I heard her on the porch steps, and I put the note back and closed the book and sat down with my coffee and waited for her to come in. She came in with a bundle of dried herbs from the lean-to, and she looked at me, and she stopped. She was the kind of person who read faces easily. She'd been doing it her whole life. I'd come to understand 40 years in a valley where everyone knew everyone, where a face told you things a conversation sometimes wouldn't, where the ability to read what was underneath what people said was a practical skill rather than an intuition. She read my face now across the kitchen, and something in it told her something. She looked at the prayer book on the table. She set the herbs on the counter. She didn't look surprised. "Where did this come from?" I said. I'd picked the note back up, couldn't help it. She crossed to the stove and checked the beans without rushing. "I know why the man is in town," she said. "I know what he's looking for." "Nora." She turned and looked at me. "The valley talks coal. I've lived here 40 years. Who gave you this?" A pause. Uriaga's boy brought it Friday. Vicent asked him to bring it. She held my eyes. Vicent thought I should know. "Vicent, I was going to have a conversation with that man." "What do you know?" I said. She came to the table and sat across from me. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked up and said, "I know a federal marshal came asking about a man named Cole Drennan. I know there are things in your past some years back that you haven't told me. I don't need to know what those things are." I put the note on the table between us. "If they come Sunday," I said, "I'll be gone before they get here." "Gone where?" "North. Colorado, then further if I have to." She was quiet. She looked at the note and then at me and then at the window where the light was going gray, the short days of October already eating into the afternoons. "Sit down," she said. "I am sitting down." "You're sitting like you're about to stand up," she said, which was accurate. I settled back in the chair. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me and kept the other, and she sat with both hands wrapped around it the way she sat when she was about to say something considered rather than immediate. I'd learned to recognize that posture. "I'll tell you what I think," she said, "and then you can argue with me or go if you need to go." "All right. If you run forever." She said it quietly, not accusingly. "I've seen it. My husband's brother, he's been running for 20 years. He writes letters sometimes. The letters all sound like a man who stopped being a real person somewhere back down the road." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "A man who runs from everything eventually runs from himself, and then there's nothing left worth saving. I looked at her. I don't know what's in your past, she said, but I know who you've been in this valley for 2 years. I know who helped me with a calf in a snowstorm. I know who fixed the adobe wall and the ditch and the barn door and never once asked for anything in return, and never once made me feel like the help came with a price on it. She looked up. I know what I've seen. The fire settled. The wind outside the kitchen window shifted. I have a history that isn't small, I said. I know. A federal marshal doesn't come 3 days' ride without something to stand on. Maybe, she said, or maybe he has something to stand on that won't hold weight when someone looks at it carefully. She held my eyes. Do you know what he has? I admitted that I didn't, not precisely. Then you don't know yet whether running is the right choice or just the fearful one, she said, without any heat in it, just stating a thing. She was right. I sat with that being right for a moment. There's a lawyer in Corrals, she said. Abelino Cruz, he's done harder work than this. He helped a man named Ariel Pryatt 6 years ago. Pryatt had a considerably uglier past than anything I've heard about you, and Pryatt is still in this valley, still working his land. She paused. I went to see Abelino yesterday. I looked at her. When? I said. Yesterday afternoon, after the boy brought the note. I set down my coffee. You went to see a lawyer for me before you'd even talked to me. She didn't look apologetic about it. I wanted to know what was actually possible before I had this conversation, she said. Otherwise, it's just two people being worried at each other, which doesn't help anything. I looked at this woman across the table from me. She'd gotten a note Friday that there was a federal marshal in town asking questions about a man she'd been letting into her kitchen for a year. And she'd responded to that information by going to the best lawyer in the county and finding out what his options were. Why, I said, it came out quieter than I meant it. She looked at me for a moment as if the question surprised her, not offended by it but slightly caught off guard, like she hadn't expected to have to explain it. Because you're a good man, she said, and good men who have made mistakes shouldn't have to keep paying for those mistakes when the law itself says the debt is closed. A pause. She looked at the prayer book. And because I've had too many people in my life taken from me by things that didn't have to happen, and I'm not going to sit here and watch it happen again without trying. The fire was doing its quiet work behind me. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did off the hills in the evenings, the kind of steady push that could go all night. Tell me what Cruz said, I said. She told me. She'd given Cruz the broad outlines of what she knew, which wasn't much, but enough to sketch the territory, and he'd asked her several pointed questions and then given her his assessment. The robbery charge was extinguished by statute, he was fairly certain. The assault charge was murkier, depending on what had happened and how it had been filed at the time. But if the woman had been physically unharmed, the charge as it likely existed was attachable to the robbery and extinguished with it. What worried Cruz was the possibility that Sully was building something newer, some more recent hook he could use, or that he planned to operate more on personal authority than legal standing. He wants to know more details, she said. He wants to talk to you. I thought about this. You'd have to tell him things, she said. The real things, not the broad outlines. I know. Can you do that? I looked at the note on the table between us. Those 7 words in their careful small caps, carrying whoever had written them's anxiety about what was coming. Arriaga, probably, through his boy. An act of care from a man who didn't have to involve himself. I've spent 14 years not telling the real things, I said, to anyone. She was quiet. It's a way of carrying it, I said. You keep the weight distributed. You don't set it down anywhere because if you set it down somewhere and then have to move on, it's worse. Better to keep moving with it. But you're not moving on, she said. That's the whole question, isn't it, whether you stay? She said it simply, looking at me across the table, and there was no pressure in it and no manipulation. She wasn't angling toward a particular answer. She was just identifying the question accurately. "Yes," I said. "Then you have to tell someone the real things," she said. "You have to let someone carry some of the weight or you'll collapse under it one day or another." She paused. "Start with Cruz if that's easier. He's a lawyer, he's heard everything." She picked up her coffee and drank from it and looked at the window. I looked at the prayer book. And then I told her. Not Cruz, her. I don't know entirely why I chose to tell her first. Maybe because she'd gone to Cruz before we even talked, and that had shown me something about where she stood. Maybe because the patient way she was sitting there made it feel like whatever I said would be received rather than reacted to. Maybe just because I'd been carrying it alone for so long, that the first available opening was going to be the one I went through. I told her the shape of the years after the war, the choices I'd made in the emptiness, the time with the Morrow bunch. I told her about the stage on the Mesilla Road, and the woman in the coach and the sound she'd made when we rode away. I told it to the table mostly, because I didn't want to watch her face change, and I told it plain, no softening, no editorializing, no reaching for the reasons I'd told myself over the years that made it something other than what it was. When I was done, it was full dark outside. She'd gotten up at some point and lit the lamp, and I hadn't noticed the room getting dim. She was quiet for a long moment. "The woman wasn't hurt," she said. "She was frightened badly." "Yes," quietly, "that's its own kind of harm." A pause. "But you stayed between her and the men who would have done worse." "That's not something I'd point to as proof of character," I said. "The bar is low when the alternative is that bad." She looked at her hands. "No," she said, "but a man who's thought about that woman's fear for 14 years is a different man than one who never thought about it at all." She looked up. "Are you the same person who was on that road in 1868? "Not much of him left," I said. "I know," she said. "I've been watching the man who has left for 2 years." She held my eyes. "Go see Cruz in the morning, first thing. Find out exactly what you're facing before you decide anything." A pause. "Will you?" The lamp threw a warm, steady circle of light across the table and across her face, and she looked back at me with a directness that I had not had from another human being in a very long time. No pity in it. No calculation. Just looking at me and seeing me and deciding on that evidence that it was worth asking me to stay. "Yes," I said. I stayed another hour. We ate the beans she'd been simmering all day, simple, good, with peppers and a little dried beef, and we talked about other things. The cattle, the coming winter, a problem she'd been having with a section of the south fence. Normal things, kitchen things. It was deliberate on both our parts, I think. A way of establishing that the conversation we just had didn't change the ground between us, that we were still two people who ate supper and talked about fence sections, and everything that came before and after that was additional. When I left, she walked me to the door, and she put her hand on my arm briefly, just a touch, 2 seconds, her hand on my sleeve, and she looked up at me and said, "You're not going to run?" Not a question. "No," I said. She nodded, that was all. I rode back to the Arriaga place in the cold October dark, and I felt, for the first time in as long as I could clearly remember, like a man who had something worth protecting. Abelino Cruz had his office on the 2nd floor of a building above the saddle shop on the main street of Corrals, up a flight of exterior stairs that had been patched so many times the patches had patches. The door at the top had his name painted on the glass in careful letters. He was a small, precise man of about 50, with ink-stained fingers and a pair of reading glasses that he took off and put on at intervals throughout our conversation in a way that seemed to correspond to whether he was thinking or talking. He had a shelf of law books behind him that looked actively used, spines cracked, papers sticking out, margins written in, and a desk covered in organized piles of documents that made sense to him if not to anyone else. He listened to me the way a doctor listens to a patient describing symptoms, attentively, without visible reaction, occasionally asking a very specific question that told you he was tracking something particular. I told him what I'd told Nora, and I added to it where the legal specifics mattered, and he asked his questions and listened to my answers. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his desk. Then he put his glasses on. "The robbery charge is fully extinguished," he said. "The federal statute ran 8 years ago. Whatever authority Sully is operating under, he cannot touch that charge." "What about the assault?" He considered this. In 1868, a complaint of terrorizing a stage passenger in the commission of armed robbery would have been filed, if it was filed at all, as part of the robbery complaint. It was not a separate charge in most territorial courts at that time, and the federal courts were inconsistent. If the woman, what was her name? "I don't know her name." If the woman filed a complaint, it almost certainly attached to the robbery charge and died with it. If she filed separately under a terrorizing provision, and some territories had them, the statute is 5 to 7 years. Still dead. He took the glasses off. What Sully may be attempting is to manufacture a more recent hook, some connection to you and a current charge, however tenuous. Or he's operating on personal authority, the badge and the threat of it, hoping you'll run or capitulate rather than challenge him. "His sister was on the stage," I said. Cruz nodded slowly. "That explains the persistence. Not the legal standing. A personal grievance doesn't create standing, but the persistence." He looked at me. "Are you inclined to challenge him?" "I was inclined to run," I said. "I'm trying to be inclined to challenge him." Something in his face that wasn't quite a smile. "That's an honest answer." He put the glasses back on. "Here's what I want. If Sully comes to serve a warrant, I want to see that warrant before you're taken anywhere. You have the right to see it. Don't resist, don't run, but insist on seeing it and send for me immediately. I can be wherever you are within an hour if I'm given notice." He paused. "And I want to make some inquiries today about the specific warrant, if one exists. There are channels for that. By tomorrow I'll know more about what he's actually carrying." "What's the realistic outcome?" I said. He looked at me over the glasses. "The realistic outcome, if the facts are as you've presented them, is that Sully has significantly less legal footing than he's implying. The realistic risk is that a determined man with a badge and hired support can make your life very difficult even without legal standing, and the territory is wide enough that unofficial pressure can accomplish what official process can't." He folded his hands. "But you're not in the wilderness. You're in an established valley, with a neighbor who came to me yesterday on your behalf, and a county sheriff who has his own views about federal overreach. You have more support here than you know." I looked at the books behind him. "The woman on that stage," I said. "If there were some way to make a kind of amends, not legal, just human, would you know how to find her?" He looked at me for a moment. "I might. Given time and some information." "It's something I've thought about for a long time," I said. "If I'm going to stand here and make this case to a marshal and a court if it comes to it, I'd like to be standing on something I can look at." He nodded slowly. "We'll talk about it," he said, "after Sunday." I rode back to the Arriaga place and did the afternoon's work and thought about what it meant to have someone in my corner. It was an unfamiliar weight, lighter than I'd expected, and warm in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not gratitude exactly, or not only that. Something more like relief at having someone else see the situation clearly and not flinch from it. Cruz had asked, as I was getting up to leave, "Is there someone who knows where you'll be Sunday?" I told him Arriaga did. "Anyone else?" I thought about Nora, about whether she'd be watching, whether she knew what was planned. "Possibly," I said. He nodded as if that was what he'd expected. "Good," he said. "A man should have people who know where he is." He paused. "That's not a legal observation, it's just a true thing." I said I understood. That night Arriaga and I had supper together, which we did occasionally when his wife and the younger children had gone to her mother's place in town. He didn't ask how Cruz went. He asked about the south pasture fence and whether I thought we'd need to move the herd north before the worst of winter, and we talked about those things, and partway through the meal he said, without looking up from his plate, "The valley would be poorer if you had to go." That was all. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't thank him, because we both understood it didn't need more than it was. Vicente Arriaga was a man who said exactly as much as the situation required and then stopped, and I'd come to regard that as one of his finest qualities. What I thought about lying in the bunkhouse that night was the phrase itself. The valley would be poorer, not, "You should stay because it's your right," not, "You've earned a place here," just the plain fact of what a presence was worth to the place that held it. The valley would be poorer. 2 years of showing up and working and being what I was, and it had added up to something, and someone had noticed and had said so in the plainest possible terms. I thought about the woman on the stage in 1868, middle-aged, well-dressed, traveling alone. I'd thought about her so many times over the years that I'd constructed a whole life for her out of nothing. She'd had some destination she'd been traveling toward, some life she'd been in the middle of, and we'd interrupted it with fear and darkness and the sound of horses and men's voices, and the particular powerlessness of being inside a stopped coach with strangers who had guns. I'd given her a name in my mind, Clara, which was probably wrong, and I'd imagined her arriving wherever she'd been going and being received by people who loved her, and who could see on her face that something had happened even if she hadn't told them yet. I thought about Cruz's suggestion of making some kind of amends. I didn't know if it was possible. After 14 years, she might be dead. She might not want to be found. She might not want anything from a man who'd been part of what had frightened her. But the possibility of it sat in my mind differently than it had before, not as something abstract and unavailable, but as something concrete and potentially reachable. Cruz had said we'd talk about it after Sunday. After Sunday. As if Sunday were a threshold we both expected me to get past. Saturday I worked and tried not to watch the road. I fed the horses and the cattle and fixed a loose wire on the near corral and split firewood that didn't immediately need splitting because my hands needed to be busy. Arriaga took his family to his wife's mother's place for the night. She was unwell, and they wanted to be near, and I was alone on the place. The aloneness was different from the aloneness of the previous years. Before, being alone on a place had been simply the condition, neutral, not good or bad, just the default state of a man who'd been living without permanent connections for a long time. Tonight the aloneness had a particular quality to it, like a room where furniture has recently been removed. Not empty, I knew the room, I lived in it, but aware of the shape of what wasn't there. In the evening I sat at the small table in the bunkhouse and I wrote, not to anyone, just to think. I'd done it before, writing as thinking, as a way of seeing what was actually in my head rather than what I was telling myself was in my head, and I did it now. What I wrote about was Nora. Not romantically, not consciously so anyway, but her presence in the writing was what I noticed when I read back over it. Every time I tried to write about what I wanted, she was part of it. The valley was part of it. The work was part of it. Arriaga's south pasture cattle were part of it. The particular quality of morning light in October was part of it. But she was the specific piece that made all the other pieces mean what they meant. Without her, the valley was beautiful but impersonal. With her, even the possibility of her, it was mine. I'd been alone a long time. Not just physically alone. I'd been in bunkhouses and camps with men all through those years, but alone in the deeper sense of having nobody who knew me. Nobody who could look at me and see the whole of it, the past and the present both, and make a choice based on the seeing. You build a life around that absence after a while. You make it workable. You find enough small satisfactions to get through the days and enough tiredness at the end of the days that the nights aren't too long. But I'd let something in the past year without quite deciding to. The woman 4 miles east with the serious face, and the prayer book, and the ability to sit in silence without discomfort, and the dry humor that surprised even her. I'd let her in incrementally, visit by visit, lunch by lunch, fence repair by fence repair, afternoon on the porch by afternoon on the porch, until she was so far in that the idea of her not being there was a specific physical sensation of loss. The closest I'd come to being known, in 15 years, was a woman in a kitchen in October who'd gone to a lawyer on my behalf before we talked, and who'd sat across a table from me and listened to the worst of it, and then told me to go see Cruz in the morning and eat the beans. I burned the pages in the stove when I was done with them. Then I lay down and went asleep, and this time it took a while. But it came, eventually it came. Sunday came in cold and hard, a heavy frost on the grass and on the corral rails and on the roof of the bunkhouse, the world gone silver in the early dark. I was up before light and I built the fire and made coffee, and I sat with it and looked at the window and waited for the sky to come. When it came, it was that particular deep blue of high country in October, clean and thin and absolute. The first light hit the tops of the pinions on the east ridge and worked its way down slowly, and by the time I was done with morning chores, the frost was starting to burn off the grass nearest the barn. Arriaga had taken his family to his wife's mother's last night. He'd asked if I wanted to come to Mass with them this morning, and I'd said no, and he'd left the bay horse saddled in the barn with no explanation, and I'd thanked him. I sat on the top rail of the corral with my second cup of coffee at 9 o'clock and watched the road. They came at 10:30. 3 riders, Sully in the middle on a big gray horse, 2 men flanking him that I didn't recognize, both carrying themselves in the particular way of men who are used to using force and are comfortable with the idea of using it now. They came up the road at a walk and turned into the Arriaga lane without hurrying, and they came straight to the corral where I was sitting. I stayed on the rail. Sully pulled up 20 feet from me. He was bigger than I'd gauged from across the street, barrel-chested, with a gray mustache above a mouth set in a patient, certain line. The badge on his chest caught the morning light. He had the look of a man who has waited a long time for a specific moment and has now arrived at it, and who is prepared to be thorough. "Coldrennan," he said. "That's me," I said. "I have a warrant for your arrest." He reached into his coat. "Federal charge of assault with menace, attached to criminal conspiracy to commit armed robbery in the matter of the Continental Stage robbery of April 16, 1868, in the territory of New Mexico." He held up the paper. He didn't offer it. "I'd like to see that warrant," I said. "I have a lawyer in Corrals who'd like to see it too." Something moved in his face, not surprise, recalculation. "You can see it when you're in custody," he said. "I don't believe that's accurate," I said, "and I suspect Cruz would agree." "Get down off that fence." I looked at him, not at his men, at him. I wanted to say what I said to the man, not to the badge. "Garrett," I said, and I watched his jaw tighten at the first name. "I know you've been carrying this for a long time. I know your sister was on that stage. I know what she went through, and I want you to know I've never stopped being sorry for it, not for a single year, not for a day." I paused. "But I'm not the man she saw on that road anymore. I haven't been for a long time, and the law itself says the debt is closed. A federal judge would look at your charge and agree with Cruz, and I think somewhere you know that." "I know you're a criminal who's been running for 14 years, he said. "I stopped running," I said. "That's why I'm still sitting on this fence." He looked at me with those cold, certain eyes, and I saw the moment when patience became decision. "Take him," he said to the man on his right. The man started his horse forward. I held still. Cruz had said don't make it look like flight. I held still on the rail and watched the man come, and I calculated exactly how much resistance was warranted and how much would be its own problem, and I'd about finished that calculation when I heard hoofbeats from the road. Fast and close. All 3 of Sully's men turned their horses toward the sound. I looked. Nora Vasquez came up the lane at a full gallop on her black mare, and she pulled between me and Sully's advancing man with a decisiveness that made the man's horse shy and scramble. She sat the mare like she'd been born on horseback, which she essentially had, and her face was set and steady, and she had a packet of papers in her left hand. She looked at Sully. "Mr. Sully," she said. Her voice was completely level. She might have been discussing irrigation schedules. "My name is Nora Vasquez. I'm a landholder in this valley. I have here a signed legal opinion from Abelino Cruz, attorney at law in Corrals, attesting that the warrant you carry is procedurally defective and that the charge it describes is extinguished under federal statute." She held out the papers. "I also have a letter from Sheriff Rafael Mendoza of this county, noting that he has been made aware of your presence in the valley and requesting that any federal enforcement actions be coordinated through his office." Dead silence. Sully's advancing man had stopped his horse. The other man was looking at Sully. Sully was looking at Nora. "Ma'am," he said, the patience in his voice had a crack in it, "this is a federal matter." "Yes," she agreed. "And federal matters in this county go through the county sheriff's office, as a professional courtesy, if not as a legal requirement. Did you speak with Sheriff Mendoza before coming out here?" A muscle in Sully's jaw moved. "Abelino will be in his office until noon today," she said. "He suggested that if you want to discuss the specific deficiencies in the warrant, he's available to do so. He's also prepared to file a formal challenge in federal court if it comes to that." She tilted her head slightly. "Though he suggested it might not come to that if you were inclined to look at the statutory question carefully." I watched Garrett Sully. I'd watched men make decisions under pressure before. It had been part of my professional education for a time, and I could usually see the moment when a decision was being made if I watched the face carefully enough. I watched his face now. He had his grievance. He had his history and his personal authority and his badge. He had 2 hired men and a warrant he'd believed was solid. What he hadn't had when he rode out here this morning was a woman on a horse with a lawyer's letter and a county sheriff's backing, and the kind of steady-eyed certainty that told you she'd done the work and wasn't guessing. He looked at me. "This isn't over," he said. "I understand," I said. "Cruz is in Corrals if you want to talk to him." He held my eyes for a long moment, and whatever he was carrying, the years of it, the grievance, the face of his sister in some parlor telling him what she'd seen on that dark road in 1868, all of it was in his face, and I didn't look away from it. I didn't owe him my absence from his grief, but I owed him something, and I stayed with it. He turned his horse. He didn't say anything else. He turned the gray horse and walked it back down the lane, and his men fell in behind him, and the 3 of them went out to the road and turned north toward Corrals, and I watched them until they were small and then gone. I got down off the rail. My legs were steadier than I'd expected. My hands were not shaking. I noted both things as facts worth keeping. Nora had gotten down from the mare and was standing with one hand on the horse's neck, watching the road. The papers were still in her hand. She looked tired in the way of someone who hadn't slept properly in 2 nights, which I suspected was accurate. She'd ridden here fast, and she was still breathing a little quick from it. "You've been at this since Friday," I said. She looked at me. "Abelino worked late Thursday and Friday both. He's earned his fee." The letter from Mendoza. Rafael owed me a favor from some years back. He was glad to repay it. She looked at the road where they'd gone. "Sully may try to build something cleaner and come back." Cruz said he didn't think so. "Cruz knows this territory better than I do," she said. "So probably not." She looked at me. "But you want to be prepared just in case." "Yes." She folded the papers and put them in her coat pocket. She stroked the mare's neck once, absently, the way you stroke a horse when you're thinking about something else. "Come over tonight," she said, "for supper. You've had enough of your own company for a few days." I looked at her. There was something in what she just said, the plainness of it, the assumption of it, the way she offered it without ceremony as if the offer were simply the obvious next thing that I needed a moment to take in. Come over for supper, not as a courtesy, not as a neighborly gesture, as the next thing, the obvious continuation. All right, I said. She nodded, gathered the mare's reins, and swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. She looked down at me for a moment. Don't be late, she said. The beans won't wait forever. She rode out of the lane at a walk, the mare moving easily under her, and I stood at the corral fence and watched her go and felt something settling in me, deep and slow, like a stone finding the bottom of still water. I was not late for supper. I came in from the cold and she handed me coffee and we ate beans at the kitchen table and talked about what had happened and what was likely to happen next and what Cruz had said, and then we talked about other things. The cattle, the winter, a book she was reading, a problem with the north fence that was going to require attention before the ground froze. After we ate, we sat by the fire with coffee and we didn't talk much. The fire did what fires do in October. It made the cold outside seem very far away and the warm inside seem very solid. The lamplight was steady. The prayer book was on the table where it always was. After a while she said, I've been thinking about what to do with the north pasture. The grass has been thin 2 years running. I wonder about the drainage. I told her what I thought about the drainage, having looked at it from a distance. She listened, and we talked about it in some detail, and this was the kind of conversation we were good at having, practical, specific, comfortable in the way of two people who have worked alongside each other long enough to have a shared vocabulary about the land. And then she said, You're going to stay. Not a question. Yes, I said. She nodded, she looked at the fire. Good, she said. That was all. But the weight of it, the single word, from a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said, was enough. I want to tell you the winter, because the winter is where everything actually happened, the real things, the ones that outlasted the drama of that Sunday. After Sully left the valley, he left entirely. Cruz confirmed it within the week. Sully had apparently spoken with the county sheriff, looked at what Cruz had assembled, and made a quiet calculation. Cruz told me later that Sully had filed a brief protest with the federal court, claiming the extinguishment analysis was incomplete, and the court had disagreed with him in a short letter. That was the end of it. A man carrying a 14-year grudge doesn't give it up easily, but a man who's also a professional eventually distinguishes between the grievance and what the law will actually support, and Sully was, in the end, a professional. About the woman on the stage, Cruz did find her eventually. It took until spring. Her name was Margaret Hartley, and she was alive and living in Denver. And when Cruz wrote to her on my behalf explaining the situation and asking if there was anything I could do, she wrote back a single page. Cruz read it to me in his office one afternoon in April. She said she remembered. She said the fear had stayed with her for a long time, the way that kind of fear stays not constantly, but in particular moments in the dark of certain rooms in the sound of certain horses. She said she didn't need my apology and didn't know what she'd do with it, but that she appreciated knowing I'd thought about it. She said she'd had a good life, and her brother had been very protective, perhaps too protective, and she hoped I'd been able to make something decent of mine. Cruz put the letter on the desk and looked at me. I sat with it for a moment. That's more than I had any right to expect, I said. Probably, he said. She's a generous woman. I sent her a letter back. I wrote it 3 times before I got it right, not right as in satisfying, because there was nothing that was going to satisfy 14 years of a woman's intermittent fear, but right as in honest and plain and not reaching for more than it could hold. I told her I was sorry. I told her what I'd done in the years since. I told her I hoped the protection her brother had tried to give her had felt like care and not like a cage. I didn't sign it cold Drennan. Cruz told me I could, that the legal matter was settled, And I said, I know, but let me sign it the way it was written, and I signed it Cole, which was what my mother had called me. I never heard back. I didn't expect to. The letter wasn't asking for anything. I stayed in the valley. Arriaga kept me on through the winter and into the spring, and in March he proposed the partnership arrangement, equity in the South Pasture cattle operation. And I told him he was being a fool, and he told me that might be so, but he'd made up his mind. We shook hands on it, and that was that. Vicente Arriaga was not a man who revisited a decision once it was made. Nora and I moved the way we moved through everything, at our own pace, without drama, building from the ground up. I was there 3 or 4 evenings a week through November and December. We'd established a kind of rhythm to it. I'd come over in the late afternoon, after the day's main work was done, and we'd do whatever the place needed for another hour or so, and then come inside and eat whatever she'd put on and talk over the day. Some evenings we talked a great deal, and some evenings we talked very little, and both kinds were comfortable in a way I hadn't had since before the war. She was teaching me to read Spanish. I'd had some Spanish from years in the territories, functional enough to conduct business and understand instructions, but not reading Spanish, and she had books in Spanish that she wanted to talk about and that I couldn't quite follow. So she'd read a passage and then we'd work through it together, and I was a slow student but a willing one, and by December I could follow the thread of most things if she read slowly enough. The reading became its own kind of intimacy. She'd sit on her side of the table with the book and I'd sit on mine, and she'd read in a low, patient voice, pausing to explain what a word meant or to clarify a construction, and I'd listen and ask questions, and somewhere in all of that the formal quality we'd both maintained, the slightly careful, slightly professional quality of two people who respect each other's privacy, began to soften around the edges. December brought a hard, cold snap, and then a week of snow, and one afternoon I was there fixing a hinge on the barn door that had failed in the cold, and when I came inside the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees, and it was dark outside by 4 o'clock. She said I should stay for supper, and I said I should be getting back, and she looked at the window where the snow was coming sideways and said, "Cole," in a tone that indicated she didn't consider this a real argument, so I stayed. We ate and talked, and then we sat by the fire with the snow still going outside, and the evening stretched out long and easy, and at some point she got up and brought a blanket and set it on the arm of my chair without saying anything, in case I got cold, which I thought about for a long time afterward. Not the blanket, the gesture, the casually domestic assumption of my comfort that it represented. Late, when I finally said I had to go and I stood up and she stood up to see me out, we stood for a moment in the kitchen doorway and she looked up at me in the lamplight. She had her wrap already on her shoulders because she'd been planning to walk me out, and the snow was still going outside and we could hear it. She looked up at me and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I said, "I'll see you Thursday." She said, "Thursday." I rode home in the snow, which was cold and not particularly pleasant, and I was warm the whole way. The conversation about Tomás happened in February, a quiet evening with snow on the ground outside. She told it plainly, as she told most things, that he had not been a good man in the end, that there had been drinking, and then, as the drinking worsened, other things she named carefully and without self-pity, that he had died in a way connected to what he'd become, in a winter accident that was partly the accident and partly the state he'd been in. She told it looking at the fire, not at me, in the measured way of someone who has told a story so many times internally that the telling of it aloud has become just the external version of a thing long worked through. When she was done, she turned and looked at me to see how I was taking it. I said I was sorry. I meant it in the specific way of being sorry for what she'd lived, not for her and not with pity, but sorry in the way you're sorry when someone you care about has had to carry something heavy for a long time. She said it was 3 years gone, and she'd had time to put it where it needed to go. "You don't have to be careful about it," she said. "I'm not fragile about it." I know you're not fragile, I said. She looked at me. I know you're not either, she said. I wanted you to know I know that. The fire did its work. Outside, the snow had stopped and the night was very still. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held mine, and we sat like that for a while without talking, and outside the world was cold and still, and inside the kitchen was warm, and I thought, here, right here, this is where the running stopped. Not on the Sunday with Sully. That was the day I chose to stop running. But stopping is a decision, and actually being stopped is different. And you don't know you're actually stopped until you're sitting in a kitchen in February with a woman's hand in yours, and the past is laid out on the table between you and neither of you is flinching from it. Here is where I stopped. In April, I asked her to marry me. I asked her on the porch in the afternoon, looking at the hills. The hills were doing what they do in April in the high country, greening up along the lower slopes where the runoff had been, the grass coming back a little tentative and thin, the light going long and amber earlier every evening. We'd been sitting there for about 20 minutes without saying much. We did that sometimes, the comfortable silence of two people who don't need to fill the space. The dog was at the edge of the porch watching something in the grass below, ears forward. She had coffee and I had coffee, and we were looking at the hills. I said, without exactly planning to say it in that moment, I'd like to stay. She glanced at me. You're here most evenings, she said, which was true. I mean, I said, more permanently than that. She looked at the hills. I mean, I said, if you'd have me. She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that I had time to consider the various ways she might respond, including the way where she thanked me and told me she appreciated it, and that she'd thought about it too, but that she wasn't sure she was ready to do it again. And I would have understood that. I want you to know I would have understood it. Permanent, she said. Yes. She looked at the hills. That's a large word. I know. I want you to be sure of it, she said. I've had a man who stayed because it was convenient to stay. I don't want that again. She paused. I want a man who stays because he's chosen to stay, every day, because he wants to. I want to, I said. I've been wanting to for longer than I've been admitting it. She looked at me. Something in her face had settled or opened. It was hard to describe exactly, the way some faces change when they've decided something. The stillness was the same but warmer. Ask me properly, she said. So I did. I set my coffee down and turned toward her on the bench and took her hand, the one with the old scar on the thumb, and I asked her properly, with her name and the whole question and all of what I meant by it. She said yes. Then she laughed the surprised laugh, the one she made when something caught her off guard, and she stopped laughing and looked at me. And her face had a quality I hadn't seen before, or not quite like this. Open, not guarded, the serious stillness that was her usual expression softened by something underneath it that had been waiting a long time to be on the surface. I wanted to say something. I couldn't quite get it out. She seemed to understand that because she didn't wait for it. She just looked at me and held my hand, and the dog on the porch looked back at us briefly and then returned to whatever was in the grass. And the hills were green and gold in the afternoon light, and that was enough. It was more than enough. We were married in July at the church in Corrals, on a hot, bright, dusty morning with the valley going green to brown below the ridge. Vicent and his wife stood with us as witnesses, and Cruz and his family took up most of the second row, and the rest of the valley filled in behind them, because Nora had been here 40 years and they all came. The church smelled of candle wax and old wood and the particular dry scent of an adobe building in July. The priest was a young man from Santa Fe who took his work seriously and conducted the ceremony with a gravity that suited both of us. There was a celebration afterward at the Arriaga place that went until the stars came out and a little past. Vicent made a speech that moved between Spanish and English at intervals I couldn't predict, and I understood about 2/3 of it, which was enough to know that it was generous and a little funny, and that it made Nora laugh the real laugh 3 times. His wife danced with me at some point in the evening, which I was not prepared for but managed without disaster. Cruz told me something quietly that I won't repeat because it was between the two of us, but I'll say it was one of the finer things anyone has said to me. We rode home at midnight, just the two of us, on a road silver with moonlight and loud with crickets, and when we got to the house she lit the lamp and put the kettle on, and I stood in the kitchen in my good shirt, and I looked at the room, the cross on the wall, the prayer book on the table, the careful placement of everything she owned, and I thought about all the times I'd been in this room over the past year and a half, and how all of those times had been leading here, to this particular evening. To this lamp and this kettle and this woman. She came to stand beside me, looking at the same room. "Well," she said. "Well," I said. She looked up at me. In the lamplight her face was warm and tired and good, and she was looking at me the way she'd been looking at me for a year, with that particular quality of seeing, but something in it had changed now. Some last held-back thing finally released, and I put my hand on her face and she turned into it, and we stood like that for a moment, and that was enough. That was everything. What I want to tell you, the thing I've been circling around, the thing that is actually the story, is what it was like afterward. Not the drama of it, not the Sunday with Sully or the confrontation at the fence. Those were events. Events happen and then they're behind you. What lasted was the ordinary. The kitchen in the morning. Her moving at the stove, coffee already poured for me by the time I came in from the early chores. The way she'd look over her shoulder when I came in, not startled, never startled, just confirming my presence the way you confirm the presence of something you're glad is there. We'd eat and we'd talk or not talk, and then the day would come in and there'd be work to do. And in the evening, we'd sit by the fire after supper and talk again or read, or just be in the same room in the particular ease of two people who don't need to perform anything for each other. I'd forgotten, or maybe I'd never really known, how much of a man's life can be carried by another person's presence. Not in the sense that you can't function without it. I'd functioned without it for 15 years and I knew how, but in the sense that certain parts of the day mean differently when there's someone to tell them to. The small things, the things you see or notice or are amused by. You notice them, and then you carry them, and then in the evening you tell her and she listens and responds, and the noticing becomes part of a larger shared thing, and that shared thing becomes what you mean when you say you have a life. She told me once, that first winter, that she'd stopped expecting to have a companion, that she'd made her peace with the Vasquez place being hers alone and managing it as best she could, and that she'd been satisfied with that mostly. That she'd prayed about it, and the answer she'd gotten was that satisfaction was a kind of gift, and not to waste it by wanting something else. And then you came and helped my calf, she said, and I thought, well, maybe the prayer wasn't the final answer. I told her I was glad she'd reconsidered. She said she generally didn't reconsider things, but in this case she'd made an exception. There was a morning in our second October together, a year on from Sully, from the note, from the Sunday of all of it. Cold, clear morning, the same deep blue sky, heavy frost on the grass. I came in from the early chores and she was at the table with her coffee and her prayer book open in front of her. She looked up when I came in. The prayer book was open to somewhere in the middle, Psalms maybe. There was no note in it. We'd burned that note back in December, the year before, put it in the stove one evening without ceremony, just both of us agreeing it was time to let it go. She'd held it for a moment before she put it in, not reading it, just holding it, and then she dropped it in and we'd watched it go. She looked at me across the table in the morning light, and I sat down, and she poured my coffee, and I wrapped both hands around the cup the way I always did when the morning was cold. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," I said. The prayer book was open between us. I could see the text from where I sat, verses she'd been reading, the familiar shapes of the words. She'd been in this book her whole life, longer than I'd been in the valley, longer than most things I'd been in. It was part of how she made sense of things, and I'd come to understand that, and to respect what it meant to her, and occasionally to sit with her quietly while she read, which was its own kind of closeness. Outside, the frost was burning off the grass in the first light. I could hear the horses starting to move in the barn, ready for the day. We had fence work to do on the south side, and Arriaga's men were coming to help with it at mid-morning, and there was a section of the water system that needed attention before hard winter, and the cattle in the north pasture needed checking because one of the cows had been looking lame yesterday. A day full of work. The best kind of day. She turned the page in the prayer book. I drank my coffee. The light came in through the east window and fell across the table and across her hands on the book and across the space between us. I thought about the note. 7 words in careful small caps, someone's warning delivered in the only way they could think to deliver it, and what that warning had set in motion. I thought about the lawyer and the sheriff's letter and a woman on horseback at a full gallop coming between me and a marshal's man, and the look on Sully's face when he realized that what he'd thought was going to be simple was not going to be simple. I thought about a kitchen table in October, and the words spoken over beans and coffee and an open fire. I thought about the sound of her boots on porch steps that I'd been hearing for 2 years now and would hear, I expected, for a good many more. She looked up from the book and found me looking at her. She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked back at the book, but there was something in the corner of her mouth that was almost a smile, not quite. She rarely went all the way to a smile except when I'd done something she found genuinely funny, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Outside, the valley was waking up. The pinions on the east ridge had their morning light in them, going gold and warm, and the creek drainage below was still in shadow, and somewhere out in the near pasture, one of the horses had found something worth investigating and was moving through the frost with a deliberate clop of hooves. A hawk went over, high, heading north. A day full of work and a woman I loved, and a place in the world I'd earned my right to, and intended to keep. I finished my coffee. She turned another page. The morning light widened across the kitchen floor, and the frost burned off, and the day opened up, and that was where I lived. That was exactly where I lived.